Allow me to show you something. Know what this is? Okay. Worthless, bedeviled contraption!
Tactics Ogre is a foundational kind of game. Like Wizardry, even if it is more obscure to the general gaming public, its influence can be felt throughout the entire strategy RPG genre. Originally released in 1995 in Japan on the Super Famicom, and directed, developed, and written by Yasumi Matsuno for the long-defunct Quest Corporation, it was the story of a young man named Denim Pavel, caught in the midst of a brutal civil war on the island of Valeria. One that broke out after the island's Dinis king, who managed to unify all of the clans under his rule, just vanished. Denim, alongside his sister Koshua Pavel and his best friend Vice Bozek, are three Wallisters struggling to survive on the losing side. Hunted both by their family's murderers, the Dark Knights of Lotus, and the Galgastani, who seek to erase all traces of the Wallister from the island by any means, they chance upon a roaming band of knights in exile, all because Vice ended up attacking the wrong Lancelot.
Wait, do you even know who we are?
You're Lancelot, and that makes you my enemy.
By their charity and valor, Denim succeeds in taking Castle Almorica and rescuing Duke Ronway, the leader of the Wallister resistance, turning the tide against the Galgastani invaders and beginning a long and blood-soaked campaign that will forge not only Valeria in the crucible of atrocity and death, but Denim himself as well, whether into a man who stands for his own beliefs or one who values victory over valor. Only he can decide. It's a story that has been told and retold a surprising amount of times, with the original version first debuting on the Super Famicom in 1995, then expanding onto the Sega Saturn a year later. One more, and it would arrive on the PlayStation.
2 O's in Bandicoot, okay, pal? Sir?
PlayStation.
And finally, after one more year, it would make landfall in the West for the first time. Then it was remade in 2010 for the PSP with the subtitle Let Us Cling Together. This version offered a number of rebalancing changes, expanding the game's script, new characters and classes, increasing how many units the player could deploy in battle, and the ability to revisit events on the game's timeline once you completed one of the game's routes. It even allowed for the player to rewind back up to 50 turns in battle. It was a monumental effort, and while it did review and sell well in Japan, the West was a far more dismal story. Though it wasn't for the game's quality, but simply because it was a PSP exclusive. 10 years later, on November 11th, 2022, the Horn of War would sound again in Valeria, as like the Phoenix of old, Tactics Ogre would be reborn on all major platforms, with yet even more changes, additions, and rebalances. But like the fabled ship of Theseus, after all of these changes, additions, and revisions, is it still the same masterpiece that Matsuno struggled to bring forth all of those years ago? On the island of Valeria, there is only war, and there is a lot of it, both in terms of the quantity of battles you will be waging and the sheer depth of mechanics that you are expected to both learn and understand. Most of these are fairly standard when it comes to SRPGs. How the turn order works, how all of the different classes work and interact with each other, how the terrain affects both your accuracy and defense, what equipment each of your units can use, etc. But Reborn the Ogre takes things quite a bit farther, to an overwhelming level. Turn order isn't decided simply by speed, but by a hidden resource called RT, which itself is influenced by what armor and class the unit is, what actions they did, and by other buffs or debuffs. Simply put, a unit that does nothing but pass their turn, or simply attacks in place, will be able to act faster than if they were to move, attack, or cast a spell, and use a skill. While simple classes may all functionally be the same, some of the more advanced ones can have wildly different roles depending on how you outfit them. For example, all archers are basically the same. Ranged warriors whose only goal in life is to harass soft targets from afar. Their skills are narrow and all work to this end, with the only real difference being whether the archer is using a bow or crossbow. And while there is a significant difference in how those weapons work, with bows being an arcing weapon that is subject to terrain and can reach for miles if you are firing downhill, while crossbows are shorter, direct, and harder punching bolts. They still serve the same purpose. Compare this to the Terror Knight, a heavily armored juggernaut who can be a tanky wall that controls the battlefield with their presence thanks to Rampart Aura, a damaging fiend that sows fear and reaps death with every swing of their weapon, or a walking malaise spreading paralysis and leeching life with dark magic. Every unit can equip 4 items, 4 spells, 4 skills, and 4 finishing moves. It's a lot of customization, and many of the classes will be able to make significant use of it. Though for most of them, one skill is going to be mandatory: their weapon skill. Because while you can easily swap any class into any other, of the appropriate race, but we'll get there, the unit's weapon skill levels are permanent. The higher the skill, the more damage and accuracy the unit does with said weapon, which would be fine on its own, but the important factor here is that finishing moves are locked behind this skill. Every 10 levels unlocks one, and these are powerful, mana-hungry attacks that will be the primary source of your physical fighter's damage once attained. Most of them are simple melee or ranged attacks with an element attached, but the more advanced ones have an ailment, extended range, or can even hit the target twice. This combined with the card system is what turns the early mid to late game into something of a shotgun war. Whoever gets theirs off first wins. Finally, the most impactful mechanic are the buff cards. All over the battlefield, cards will spawn that can be picked up by moving a unit onto it. These cards will buff a unit depending on which one it is: physical attack, magical attack, critical chance, skill activation chance, and mana generation. All units can hold a maximum of 4, and these cards are powerful. A physical fighter with just 1 physical card is dangerous. 2 of them, and they become a killing machine. Don't mind me, just a casual 4K damage. A healer that gets their hands on a skill card will be able to cast their best heals more often. 2 will mean they can drop fully charged heals every turn. These cards last until the end of battle, even through death, so long as you don't step on these red purge cards, which might not be as simple as that sounds, since knockbacks happen surprisingly commonly with physical attacks. And to answer the question, yes, you and the enemy can absolutely die horribly by getting knocked off the map and falling into the abyss. It's quite terrifying, especially in the late game when you start dealing with incredibly narrow strips of terrain. It is not an exaggeration to say that the existence of these cards will warp your tactical thinking. Getting them in the hands of the right units is the key to winning battles. The game makes it very explicit in the opening tutorial that the key to victory is focusing down the enemy 1 unit at a time, and these cards in combination with the finishing moves are a significant part of how you'll do this. To spurn the cards is to spurn victory itself. There is a lot more to go into in terms of the game's mechanics, both ancillary mechanics such as the elemental affinity system, how the weather affects ranged attacks and movement,
Chaos frame!
to the far more critical things, like recruiting units and the Union level system, and its effects on progression and outfitting and equipping your Legion. But before we get there, I need to answer a simple question. And yes, this is very early to be doing this, but it's going to color every other thing I'm going to discuss going forward. It's unavoidable, because of how early the game starts going in. I need to do this now, because it's genuinely hard to discuss anything more than this without spoiling things. Do I recommend Tactics Ogre Reborn? I honestly don't know, but I'm leaning toward no. I will be upfront. I have only completed one route through the game. I have no interest in seeing the other ones. I just don't have the will or stomach for it. The act of playing this game because of how its systems mesh together is so utterly exhausting that I needed to will myself to come back and finish it multiple times over the course of 4 months. This game was originally going to be the second game I planned to review for the channel. I started it all the way back in October after finishing Silksong. But over time, I kept losing interest or just kept getting annoyed or frustrated at it. Over and over again. Once I got past Chapter 1, the game kept hammering me over the head with the simple fact that all of the rebalancing and revisions or conflicting mechanics just couldn't be fixed. Every single battle was almost the exact same. And no matter how lavish the game's presentation is, with the excellent voice acting by multiple talented VOs with excellent performances, even if I think their audio is tuned a little too low, and the orchestral remixes of the original soundtrack, it really just can't help save the game from being this bloated mess that feels like it's almost trying to fuck with you with just how unnecessary and counterintuitive its mechanics are. That's going to sound insane, I know. You are seeing multiple different battlefields, all with varied terrain, but it's true. And it's going to take quite a bit to explain why, but bear with me. Because I need to pour all of this frustration out, so I can explain how out of all of the SRPGs I have played over the years, this one felt like, mechanically at least, that it's the one that wanted to waste my time the most. Let me start by going out of the battlefield itself for a moment and talk about the root of all men's hearts, the economy. The sheer amount of items that are available in Reborn is utterly insane. Helmets, body armor, gloves, boots, and accessories. Every unit in your army, with the exception of monsters, are going to need to be outfitted. And that's the minimum. From there, you have 10 weapons, including shields, 10 plus schools of magic, including ninjutsu, ninpo, and war dances, and every single school of magic except for light, dark, and the other two are functionally the same. Multiple tiers of single-target arrow spells and AoE magic, plus an affinity ailment that the damage spells already inflict anyway, so why are they here? Then you have consumables, healing herbs and mana herbs with far too many levels and tiers than necessary. That's a huge amount, especially when I remind you again, every unit can equip 4 items and 4 spells. And if that were all there was to this, I'd say that this sheer amount of items to manage was a lot, but doable. All games with large rosters run into this, and since the maximum amount of units you will field in battle is 12, plus extras since there are a number of classes that you will only bring for certain maps, like the Dragoon, who's only good for deleting monsters. It's a sizable amount of work to outfit and manage a roster that big. But it's not, because we got all of the consumables that give buffs and debuffs, the ones that cleanse those, the elemental bombs, and the items that inflict ailments. All of them. And there are over 60 of them. Well, you aren't going to use most of them, either because they're not worth the effort or you just won't have the money to afford them. The fact that all of this guff is in here just clogs the menus with an overwhelming amount of junk. And these menus, holy shit! They're more nested than a 90s Ninja Turtle's mouth. Most SRPG menus try to keep things simple, conveying all relevant information at first glance or in a help menu like Fire Emblem. But Reborn is just so fucking bloated that every item has, at minimum, 5 tabs. After all, they need to convey how much RT does it eat up, how much damage does it do, is the damage slash, blunt, or piercing, any elements, does it have a racial bane on it, does it have a chance to inflict an ailment or resist one, does the item have a skill on it, did it fill out its W2 form, did you, and also, which classes and races can equip it. This is all important stuff, but it's such a pain in the ass to fiddle about all of these panels and submenus when some of this stuff could have been condensed into 2 or 3 tabs, not 5. And to sift through them, you don't just hit the shoulder bumpers. You have to hold X, then go left and right. And it wouldn't be that bad if there was a decent sorting option, but there isn't. For your items or your roster, you can't just simply sort them by class or drag and drop units around to help differentiate your A-team and your reserves. You have to fiddle with their individual number, and it's just, ugh. All you can do to try and make your inventory management easier is to try and sell obsolete stuff or useless consumables. And if that were enough, I'd say the economy is annoying, but tolerable for the sake of the sheer amount of customization available. And it isn't as if the game isn't trying to alleviate this issue. It will helpfully auto-refill items on your units after every battle, so long as you have them in stock. Genuinely, one of the most appreciated things to do if you're going to make it so everyone has their separate inventories. But then there's a crafting system on top of it, which means there are tens if not 100 different raw material items on top of it, all of which do nothing except for fueling a system that I would at best call woefully underdeveloped, and at worst an albatross on the game itself because, while yes, there are technically some weapons and rings you can make, they are incredibly niche or require materials that are so uncommon I only did it once or twice. I made a blow dart that had a chance to petrify enemies and some rings that upped agility. And that was about it. So what do you do with this system? You upgrade your equipment. Yes, all of it. All of it! For every soldier in the goddamned army. And before you tell me, well, you don't have to do that, surely you can cut corners for the healers or casters, right? No. No, you can't. Because here's the thing. Upgrading gear does increase the defense or attack power a nominal amount. Not earth-shattering, but it is noticeable when a cleric with basic robes gets hit with an arrow and one with proper armor does. But the reason you do this is because upgrading gear can enable skills on said gear. Weapons can inflict extra ailments or deal extra damage to certain races. Staves and bows can get additional range. Some pieces give you the chance to counterattack or parry basic attacks, which, with how many times I've had wizards and clerics parry auto swings, I can assure you just how impactful that is. And pants and gloves can give extra movement range, either in water or just in general. I don't think I need to explain how pivotal movement range is in a tile-based tactics game like this. Boots can give jump too, which is also surprisingly important because this game is an uphill struggle, both literally and metaphorically, and it can mean the difference between a unit being stuck in a river unable to do anything or getting out. And while you might say, well, can't you only upgrade the stuff that doesn't give those critical skills? And the answer is no. The game explicitly doesn't tell you what the upgrade will do until you do it. And like the rest of the menus, it's just as clunky and nested as the rest of them. You could check outside sources, and you're probably going to need to for recruiting unique characters, but I can't endorse needing a guide for something as basic as this. It just feels too simple to justify the effort. Upgrading isn't cheap either. Theoretically, you can try and save some goth by individually upgrading raw ore into higher tier materials instead of just buying them from the shops, but it's not practical, and a significant amount of materials aren't sold in shops at all. Instead, they're drops from monsters or rewards for selling them off, which we'll get to why that feels bad in a bit. You'll spend the majority of the gold you make from dropped oberiths on selling excess armor on +1ing all of your gear. The rest will go into healing items, revival stones, and spells. And you're going to need it, because Reborn is a pretty merciless game. You'll always be fighting against superior forces time and time again on maps that are not designed in your favor, which means the enemy is going to kill people, no matter how hard you try to prevent it. They're going to get streaks of units acting in sequence, and sometimes they all just pick the same target to get got. Just like you will. Fortunately, death is slanted in the player's favor, where the enemy will instantly dissolve into a loot bag or a tarot card that grants a permanent stat boost, or loyalty, which doesn't matter in Reborn, because even if in theory your units could defect, so long as you aren't purposefully killing and reviving them, it will never get low enough to risk that. Your unit will simply fall to the ground as a timer ticks over their head. If they're dead for 3 turns in a row, they're permanently gone. And that sounds bad, but you get a huge amount of time to revive them. And if you can win the battle before they fade away, they'll be just fine. And you can even weaponize those revives because they're almost certain to immediately get their turn afterwards, leading to some funny revival chains or clutch maneuvers. It's probably the most fair sort of permadeath I've seen in any game with it. You really can't fault the game for it if you let it happen. There's one more thing I'd like to discuss before I start to talk about my problems with the game's combat as a whole, but it's a topic that will lead into it. You're going to need to get more soldiers to join you, and while you absolutely can just hire Johnny Greenhorn or Jane Freshly from the shop for 1,000 goth, they're going to be more delicate than a newborn, requiring multiple rounds in training battles just to catch up with the rest of your army. Not to mention grinding their weapon skill, and the pool of classes to buy is fairly basic. It's boring, you can't get any loot doing them, and the deeper into the game you are, the longer the process will be. Wouldn't recommend it except for early in the game if you get stuck under-leveled. Fortunately, the game includes what I consider to be both the best and worst recruiting system I've seen. With the exception of bosses, unique characters, and some late-game enemies for narrative reasons, you can recruit almost every single regular enemy you encounter in non-training battles. See someone with a new class? You could get them ahead of the curve. Want a pet griffin? A pet octopus? A goddamn dragon? You can get them! And they're pretty good, too. They can't equip anything except for accessories, but they're tanky and surprisingly powerful when supported with a Beastmaster. You can even get some humanoid monsters like lizardmen, gorgons, and pixies who have their own unique classes that are also surprisingly effective. All you gotta do is just ask. After all, the worst thing they could do is say no. Right? Right?
You serious?
You remember when you were a kid, or maybe you still enjoy Pokemon today, I don't know, I'm not your dad. But you remember trying to catch a roaming legendary Pokemon like Entei or Suicune? You get its health down to below 10%, you slather it in sleep powder and you chuck Ultra Ball after Ultra Ball, and yet it just won't get in it. but then it wakes up and in defiance of all that is good and holy, gets off a roar and runs away. Paradoxically, like Odin before him, Matsuno managed to find Mimir's wellspring, and upon taking a sip and gaining infinite knowledge, he had a thought. What if we could do that, but make it so much more frustrating? Because here's the thing about Pokemon. It is, by and large, a one-on-one matter. Just you and the quarry. Trying to play Pokemon in a war zone is a whole other matter. Here is the process and how it works. First, you spot a unit you want in battle. Then you equip the appropriate skill on one of your units that will allow you to try and recruit it. This is harder than it sounds, because identifying which skill will work on the target isn't always as simple as you'd think. Sure, humans, griffins, and dragons are obvious, but fairies like Magda here could just as easily be mistaken for being an angelic cherub. And while there is a skill that explicitly calls out lizardmen, there isn't one that does so for the Gorgons. And I still don't know what works on imps. A significant amount of these are exclusive to the squishier classes, like wizards and clerics, so you have to put some of your delicate units at risk to do it. Then you need to try and isolate the target and beat them within an inch of their life. Keep in mind that the enemy will field healers just like you, so you'll need to kindly ask them to die in a pit beforehand. Then, you need to bring your negotiator directly next to the target, and it does need to be directly next to them, because the success rate dies if you're not. And finally, you look at that 30% chance, be grateful for it, and pray it works. It probably won't, and every refusal will just increase their loyalty, and if that loyalty hits max, then it will never work. The worst part of this process is that, unlike Pokemon where you're incentivized to try and paralyze or put the Pokemon to sleep to increase your odds of success, doing so will make it impossible to recruit them. All mental ailments will do this, including terror, which is its own can of frustration because one of the best skills in the game, Lament of the Dead, randomly fears nearby enemies. Oh, we will get to that. Which means that you need to have the subject still be able to move and fight. So at best, he'll run around and keep hitting your squishy negotiator. And at worst, they'll just kill themselves on one of your units with a counterattack. I cannot express, in meager English, the sheer amount of times this mechanic made me oscillate between moods. I had recruits where I got it on the first shot, and it was easier than pie. I had recruits that I had to sit there holding my dick in my hand for ages, with my entire army surrounding the recruit, just staring at him and wondering why the fuck they won't just get with the program here. I even got lucky and managed to get a recruit when a cockatrice was going to literally die the very next turn to poison. You got like a 41%. I've never seen better odds. Hey, we got him. And he died. In theory, you can use the Chariot Tarot to rewind turns to take multiple bites of the apple to increase your odds. The RNG seed changes so long as you do something different. Move to a different tile, use an item, etc., etc. But I never got it to work for me, so who knows if it does. People say it does, but I can't verify that. I really wanted to try and capture at least one of every monster to experiment and toy with all of them. There is even a character you can only get by capturing and turning in one of every elemental dragon in the game. I gave up halfway through, though, because to my dismay, I simply needn't have bothered. Because Reborn, and I suspect the older versions of Tactics Ogre, run into a paradox that makes this process almost not worth the trouble. You see, Most SRPGs generally stick to one of two philosophies when it comes to units. Either they are unique characters, or they're generics. There are benefits to both ideas. Unique characters are characters. They're people with personalities, stories, and facets that can cause you to care about them for more than just combat utility. They help to humanize any war story to not just make it about numb statistics. But they tend to be rigid and inflexible. It's a little weird if Gonbar Strong Lad suddenly picked up a book of spells even if you really needed a mage over a bandit. Generics, on the other hand, can be anything you need them to be. They can be silent game pieces, or you can insert your own canon onto them. It doesn't really matter if you decide to radically change their archetype because at the end of the day, they're just mathematical platforms to leverage stats against enemies to achieve victory. But then, we run into a problem if both exist in the same game. If generics are stronger than uniques, then their narrative presence gets undercut. It's not a good feeling to recruit that cool character after a pivotal moment in the story, only to just dump them in the barracks and never use them again. But if they are strong enough to warrant use, then they're going to push out a unit you've grown attached to, either by just being the same character archetype but with higher stats, or having access to abilities that far outstrip them. They tend to become near mandatory to use, thus limiting your options. Reborn falls into the latter category and falls into it hard. Because while there are some semi-unique characters who are named and have dialogue lines, who are statistically slightly better than their generic versions, there are a large number of unique characters that are far, far better than most generics. Let me introduce you to two of them, Canopus and Vice.
That's enough squawking out of you, Birdman.
Better a bird than a brute.
Canopus is a winged humanoid that you get as early as the 4th battle. Being able to fly would be enough to warrant use since that mobility makes him great for scooping up cards, but give him a crossbow and he becomes one of the best ways to get behind enemy lines and harass squishy casters. Eventually, he'll get access to finishers that can slow, do AoE damage, and even stop enemies. The only thing that will be able to brush him off are armor knights, and while those are very common, he'll easily be able to grab a full hand to start filling fools full of daylight. The man was a major linchpin to my army, but there is no one better than Vice himself. Vice's unique class is Ranger, but really, it should probably be Chosen of Corn, because this dual-wielding hewer of men is a goddamn killing machine. Unlike the generic ninja, he doesn't get access to ninpo skills or ninjutsu magic, but he really would only be weaker with them. He's more durable, faster, and he can throw items across the field to provide spot healing or apply breach to bosses. And the moment I gave him a pair of winged boots to give him flight, he and Canopus just started running a train on the campaign. They aren't even the strongest ones. I also had access to a pair of white knights who could randomly cause nearby allies to move faster. And you could even get access to one of the Knights of Lotus, who are fucking monsters in combat if you manage to fulfill the conditions for it. The only problem with uniques like these is that some of their conditions to recruit them are impossible to do by accident. Now granted, a good amount of characters will join you so long as you don't kill them in battle. Even some enemies, so long as you don't overshoot their health, will shift stone out and come back later. But determining who is evacuating because the plot demands it, and who is a genuine candidate is impossible. And while I would suggest you look up a guide to determine how to get the characters on your chosen route, multiple times when I did, I found that I either progressed the plot too far and missed my shot, or I answered some arbitrary 50-50 question wrong, even though I felt they were basically saying the same damn thing. Yet funnily enough, it's the ones who start as enemies that are far easier to have survive, because some of them will instead be allied in battle, and you'll need to try and keep them alive without direct control. The difficulty of doing this varies wildly. Some of them are fine. They can survive for a while, and you're close enough that you can attract the enemy's attention and buy them some breathing room while you heal them. But then there's Captain Jack Sparrow here, who decides to start shit while being 10 miles deep in Port Tortuga with nothing but a flintlock pistol and a dream. When I tell you that I had to orchestrate an insane Saving Private Ryan scheme to try and haste a griffin in order to airdrop a bunch of rare, full healing items to try and keep him alive long enough to rescue him, and then, even though I went into the optional dungeon he unlocks and made it to the bottom, I still didn't get to recruit him. I couldn't help but wonder if Davy Jones had a point about this guy. Finally, there was one character who I did succeed at recruiting, but it involved going to a random-ass town while it was raining that I had no reason to go to after barely defeating her, which you have no way to know from the overworld that's happening, so you have to go there, do a training battle, make it rain using some items, win or leave, and then re-enter the town to trigger the cutscene. If I wasn't explicitly told to do this, I never would have known it was even possible. And yet, despite this, all of this, I found trying to play Pokemon in the middle of a war zone to be less tolerable than just sucking it up and using the uniques I'd gotten. Which is such a shame, because I've wanted an SRPG where monsters were a viable option. And they are! All of them are just as complex and have tactical niches as the humans and demi-humans. But the hassle of recruiting them and needing to bring a handler class like a Beastmaster or a Warlock to get the most out of them made utilizing them too much of a hassle. Before I talk about my issues with the game's combat as a whole, I need to clear up a few details that makes Tactics Ogre's combat a bit unique compared to other games. Starting with mana. It's not unheard of for every unit to start at 0 mana and gain some at the start of their turn, but in most games the amount of mana gained per turn will scale with the unit's maximum mana, meaning that casters will naturally gain more than melee fighters. This is theoretically true here too, because while fighters do gain mana by doing basic attacks, it pales in comparison to the potential gain of casters. Casters and healers have to rely on meditation, a passive skill that generates a surge of mana at the start of their turn. The problem is that the activation chance for meditation is random, which means that fight by fight, it is entirely possible for your casters to be left with too little mana to do their jobs properly once your units start to reach the enemy. This can be covered over with mana herbs, but they're weirdly rare. You can't buy them, and they only seem to randomly appear in optional dungeons. I ended up having to do without them well into the mid-game, which you wouldn't think should be the case since it feels like every goddamned enemy wizard and healer is just railing those bad boys like their life depended on it, but I digress. So you'd of course want to feed your casters skill cards to overcome this mana drought. But this feeds into another problem. A significant amount of passive skills are proc-based like this. Not all of them, like auras, dual wielding, ailment resists, and bonus max health and mana are purely passive, but a significant amount of them are random procs, from defense buffs, attack buffs, increased range, movement range, increased healing, spell accuracy, which is vital for landing ailments. I forgot to mention, those are a godsend, debuffs and more. Nearly every class has at least one, and at first, I was kind of happy for it, since it meant spending more of my turns fighting instead of setting up. Except when you absolutely need one of these things to go off, and they just don't for ages because that's how the RNG works. However, my biggest problem with the system is this: the sheer amount of time eaten up as you need to wait for all of them to fire before you can start ordering your units starts to add up quickly, both in battles as you pick up activation chance cards, and through the campaign as you unlock more and more of them across your army. It's like having an annoying little brother constantly grabbing your controller over and over, going, "Hold on. Okay. Wait, hold on. Okay." It turns battles into a slog once you've effectively won and are just trying to kill the last target, so all of these support buffs and procs on units who can't possibly contribute to killing the threat just waste so much time. But it isn't the only thing that feeds into this problem. The map design in general causes battles to just drag out for ages. They're all just so big. Probably to accommodate the 20+ amount of units that will be fighting on them, but while they do look nice, it just results in there being a lot of dead turns as you slowly inch your people toward the enemy. I suspect that this was done to try and give your casters time to get mana, and for you to try and grab some cards that spawn in, but since the card spawns are also random, they can wind up landing in places that are either so far out that going for them isn't worth it, or they're just unreachable without flight. Even if the maps were all flat, this would be an issue. But you'll be fighting through swamps, craggy valleys, forests, deep ocean caves, towns, beaches, and castles. A lot of castles. Way too many castles, in my opinion. The layout of which will vary wildly from being easy and roomy to cramped and obnoxious. The game, or at least the route I took, has a nasty habit of luring you in with a lot of easy terrain early on, and even giving you the height advantage once or twice before hard turning into making almost every battle into an uphill struggle through narrow stairways and bridges. It's understandable why this is from a narrative perspective. You are always the aggressor. The game narratively contorts itself to justify this setup over and over again to its detriment, by positioning Denham's force as either the vanguard of his faction or the hidden knife circling behind a decoy force to strike at the enemy's heart. But because of this, you almost never get to use the land to your advantage. You don't get to use the height to rain death down on the enemy without being able to fly. You don't get to funnel enemies into a choke point because their setup is designed to be able to either bypass the hostile terrain or it's carved to their favor. The biggest example of this problem are sieges. Multiple battle gauntlets that force you to complete them without being able to stock up in stores, culminating in a hard boss to take the fortress. Some of them do give you a choice on which side you want to approach from, but it's very much a pick-your-poison scenario. Do you want to deal with a long moat against a bunch of octopi? Or would you prefer fighting against a sheer cliff with a narrow stairway against a wing of archers and mages raining death from above? Even the one exterior siege that let me choose a flat plain was covered in maze-like bushes. I think the best image I can give you to show just how absurd this terrain design is one of the final battles in the game. The very top of the Hanging Gardens. You start here, on this narrow strip of land, with the only access onto the platform where the enemy is this tiny, single-file stairwell, and of course, there is no feasible way for most of your army to get up before the enemy crowds the stairwell, blocking you from ascending and blasting you with dragon fire. The only solution I had was to simply go up there with Vice and Canopus and abuse the revival mechanic to cheese the boss, and while you might call that clever tactics, when you do it for the 20th time in a campaign, it feels less like tactics and more like an exploit. Look at this image! Even the enemy army thinks this whole thing is stupid! I have a theory. Call it a game design theory, if you will. That every game genre has a set of universal truths that no matter how much a designer might want to subvert or get away from, the effort to try just causes more issues. Some of them are bigger problems than others, Civilization 7, trying to have more people finish campaigns by breaking the game into 3 eras or mini-campaigns, just resulted in people getting frustrated at having the board state reset against their will, for example. I believe SRPGs have a similar unsolvable problem. SRPGs can't make good boss fights. Unpredictability and adapting to it is critical in strategy, but bosses unrestrained have the chance to blindside and brutalize the player in ways that can't be accounted for. Yet they have to be strong, since the player will be able to approach them with overwhelming force. Striking this balance with the sheer glut of options this genre gives to the players is a pipe dream. Fire Emblem with permadeath and no way to interact on the enemy's turn was forced to shackle most of its bosses to a throne like a dog on a post. XCOM 2's Chosen can randomly ambush you during missions, but their goal isn't to kill your soldiers, it's to capture them, limiting the potential harm they can inflict to your war effort by offloading some of it onto the macro stage instead of potentially resulting in a mission failure if you can't repel them. But Reborn doesn't have any checks against its bosses. It gleefully lets all of them run rampant to do as they please, while starting with a full hand of cards to make them enduring, brutal, and devastatingly dangerous. Just imagine dealing with Seto Kaiba, starting every game with a Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon on the field on turn 0.
You're a third-rate duelist with a fourth-rate deck.
This isn't that bad early on, since bosses can be any class from berserkers, archers, wizards, and even occasionally clerics. But for the vast majority of sieges, the boss is almost always a goddamned knight. So not only will they easily be able to crush anyone they get their hands on, they'll be hard to kill, practically immune to ranged fire and resistant to magic, meaning that simply bum-rushing the boss isn't a viable plan. You need to chew through his legion first just to reach him or get to the healers that will do everything they can to keep them alive. Which would be fine until the late game, once you start fighting the Knights of Lotus, who are all Templars and Knight Commanders, the ultimate in bullshit technology. They're less knights and more armored dark wizards, gleefully dropping meteors from on high inside of congested arenas with narrow choke points and stairwells. This ham-handed approach to difficulty is something that you will be forced to contend with over and over and over again, since the entire campaign is simply fighting towards siege battle after siege battle after siege battle over and over again. Fighting an endless train of armor knights with different faces and voice actors who are all functionally the same trial on endless repeat. There are, quite literally, only 2 victory conditions in this entire game. Either you have to completely rout the enemy force, or kill their leader. There are no other objectives, no trying to escape an overwhelming force, no mandatory VIPs to protect, no pylons or stationary targets that you need to reach. Nothing else except killing the enemy. The closest thing you get are the optional recruits to protect, and trying to find doors to open pathways in late-game dungeons, but these only serve as a potential way to grind experience and gather loot, recruits, and materials. If there is any singular aspect of this game that screams this thing is from the SNES era, it's this. It feels just like Fire Emblem 6, the GBA one that we in the West didn't get, where every goddamn map was a Capture the Throne one. And while in most RPGs, with sufficient grinding, you could simply overpower the difficulty through raw numbers, Reborn's Unity level puts a hard cap on your unit's level that grows as you progress the campaign. Normally, I would actually love this system. I love savoring good RPG battles, and a level cap is an excellent way for the developers to set an intended power level for the player to experience fights as intended. to torque the player's mind and force them to think creatively, to seek solutions around raw power. And yet, almost every facet of the game's design fights with itself. The same cards that help to force your thinking beyond optimal movements and attacks end up being used to homogenize all of the bosses into walking artillery pieces. The same flexibility in class design and customization runs headlong into how clunky the UI is, with needing to fiddle and swap units over and over again to deal with edge cases and counter skills. Ugh, the sheer amount of times I forgot to swap my Dragoon from focusing on killing beasts or dragons is just embarrassing. The ranged firing arc system that rewards clever thinking and aiming tricks like targeting your ally so you hit an enemy in your dead zone, forcing you to constantly have to find the sight lines through allies and bushes, even when they're on the ground dead. Even vestigial mechanics like the elemental affinity system are utterly counterintuitive. You would think, for magic, that using a fire spell against someone with ice affinity would matter in terms of damage. But no. What matters is the affinity of the person. So why do we even bother with having all of this excess magic? Functionally, they're all the same except for the aversion debuffs they stick on the enemy. Is that worth clogging up the menus with sheer bloat? This isn't even getting into the other vestigial mechanics like Chaos Frame. I can't escape the feeling that in an effort to make a 2-decade-old game new again, Reborn has tried to force-feed it with more and more mechanics and guff, which only results in this weird, chaotic, clunky, and overburdened mess. Too many units, too many mechanics, too many procs, too much land combined with a very old encounter and objective design that just causes everything to drag and drag to the point of exhaustion and tedium. So then why? Why is it that despite all of this, I can't definitively say whether or not I recommend Reborn? It should be obvious that with all of this frustration and tedium, I should hate it. And yet, I still wanted to finish it. I still wanted to see the end of Denham's story. Not because of him, to be frank, but because of everyone else around him. And of course, Matsuno's brutal and unflinching ability to portray the horrors of war. You've probably heard the words I'm about to quote before many times. A film director named Francois Truffaut is attributed to have said that there is no such thing as an anti-war movie, that the medium of film itself makes it impossible to portray war without glorifying its existence. The bombs that fall and explode in the background that threaten the characters' lives are but dazzling fireworks to us, the audience. Every story has its protagonists, and we, the audience, naturally root for them. We revel in their triumphs and mourn their losses and failures. It is only natural, since we view the world through the director's eyes. But video games are quite different, in my opinion. There are a lot of ways to convey an emotion or a sentiment through play, sometimes with intentionality, others purely by accident. I don't think that all of my mechanical issues with the game are some brilliant play by Square Enix, who long ago absorbed Quest into its formless body to try and portray the grinding horror of war. Matsuno's writing, however, I do think is absolutely intentional. Most SRPGs are content to have its enemies be simple, throwaway nobodies. Either they're bandits, aliens, nameless grunts of the Empire, or literal demons from hell that exist to be easy villains. Cartoonish monsters who exist purely to be crushed under the hero's boot. Disposable. And while Reborn isn't completely bereft of characters like this...
Ah, but how best to thank you? A meal, perhaps? I'm quite the chef, you know. I'll tell you my secret. Preparation is everything. A silver fork, a silver knife. First, I'll cut off both your arms. Run the left through with the fork, and the right with the knife, I believe. And for the soup, molten lead goes down best. I'll slice your neck and pour it down your throat, so there'll be no need for a spoon. Then, I think, a thin cut of flesh from your back. Raw, bleeding. You like steak, no? And next...
Enough, Oz. This is no time for your games.
The vast majority of its characters are distinctly human. Though, funnily enough, you wouldn't notice this by just looking at the primary cast members. The game's story tends to focus on the major power players, the ones who seek to claim Valeria for themselves, and those agents from the outside who seek a darker secret hidden beneath. Most of them are, of course, either grizzled veterans who consider this bloody work to just be their way of life, or would-be tyrants who view their subjects as pawns in a game of power and blood. But Matsuno knows that every soldier has their own story. Stories buried deep in the Warren Report, an in-depth catalog of the game's mechanics, history, timeline, and characters. It's very handy at helping you remember who people are, since there are a lot of names and proper nouns to contend with, particularly with some of our colloquial terms for leaders and bodies of power having their own fantastical name, such as priests being called Abuna. But something in particular I enjoy is just how in-depth it goes in terms of the character's background. Permit me to give an example. A Galgastani who served his clan in battle hails from a family of farmers in a small village in the Kuritanai region, where he lived together with his parents, grandparents, and 6 sisters. As a Galgastani, he revered Hierophant Balbatos and was eager to join the army. His parents were staunchly opposed, for he was their only male child. Still, on the day he left, his mother presented him with a fine jacket of tawny brown that his father had bought for him, so he might not be ashamed of his low station. Many were the youths like Camelot who joined the Galgastani host out of an abundance of patriotism, a clearer sign than any of the Hierophant's influence. While delivering supplies to Brigantes Castle, he encountered the resistance on the Bahana Highlands and died in battle, having never learned of Brigantes Castle's fall to Sir Hector and his father's stratagem. You might understandably think that this poor soul is someone important to have such a lavishly detailed backstory, but he's just an unfortunate sod who didn't even realize that the castle he was protecting was captured behind his back. And behind every random man or woman Denim waters the soil with is a story just like this. Not all of them are good or kind people. There's a number of Galgastani who, let's just say, would probably be a shoo-in for getting elected governor of Florida. But there are Wallister, Bakram, and Lodicians who are just as vile and hateful or self-interested. That's just humanity. Desperate men and women who seek to protect their homelands, fathers and brothers trying to put food on their families' tables, fools who have been sold delusions of their base superiority by monarchs who view them as extensions of their own power, all of them struggling to survive in a rigged game being played on a table, atop an even greater table, that not even the leaders of the first could even dare to look down from their high thrones to see beneath them. And that isn't even getting into Denham's campaign itself, which I've tried to avoid discussing until now, but we're past the threshold. Because the final reason why I cannot simply write off Tactics Ogre is to do with something utterly unique to it. Something that in all of my years of playing video games I am ashamed to see none have the courage to face head-on. Let me ask you all a simple question. When you think of player-controlled evil or bad playthroughs, what is it that you see? The first thing that comes to my mind is, of course, the renegade shepherd from Mass Effect, a brash, selfish, callous asshole who cares only for himself, the mission, and humanity, with little disregard for life except for human life, and even that is somewhat in question due to the changing nature of what renegade meant over the course of the trilogy. Mass Effect as a series strived to make player choice matter, but it struggled against the same problem all RPGs do whenever they let the player be evil. It can only think in terms of cartoon villainy, with flashy acts of flagrant, flippant violence that are ultimately less helpful than if he simply kept his gun in his pants. It goes against the overarching theme of the series that through cooperation and putting aside petty grievances, people achieve great things, overcome impossible odds and avert disasters, both cosmic and man-made, to fix mistakes made by our forefathers, even if it's hard to do so. No, especially if it's hard to do it. Which is why, while sadly not as unrealistic as I naively hoped it'd be, it tends to come off as cartoonish and stupid. Similar to how Truffaut said there is no way to make an anti-war movie, I have found it difficult to truly find a game that doesn't perversely find some way to glorify evil deeds by making it cool.
I've got nothing more to say to you. If you shoot me, my team...
How about goodbye?
Because sure, kicking puppies and setting off dormant nukes in the middle of an innocent town is bad, but look at all these cool lightning powers I get for it. These sick-ass devil horns? I get to turn a bunch of antagonists that gave me trouble in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous into undead minions, and all it costs me is my soul and mortality. Did you see that one-liner I got to drop as I lit his ass on fire?
A simple target. Hell yeah, brother, let's go!
It's pointless and uninteresting to me from a narrative standpoint. Cruelty for cruelty's sake. It genuinely doesn't surprise me that the vast majority of people chose Paragon because, frankly, despite what we see on TV and who ends up in positions of power, most people don't like being an asshole. At least without it being prompted by a slight or a bad day or exterior problem nagging at them, or enough fear to justify acting in such a manner. And in the end, Shepard still needs to eventually save the world, so the characters still do need to support him and work with him, no matter how depraved and wantonly cruel he acts. Since he's justified by both the structure of the narrative and the in-game role of being a Spectre, he is quite literally above accountability to anyone else, even if some of the people he wrongs do push back.
I know what you did.
What the hell pissed him off?
I don't know. He just went crazy.
Yeah, Krogan can do that. Genophage makes them screwy and nothing to live for, so they just snap. Well, whatever. Just another mess to clean up now.
They have to be doomed to fail by the nature of the story. It feels both artificial and kind of fucked up that, despite how controversial Mass Effect's 3 ending was, that both the Shepard who tries to save the world with the help of unifying all of the galaxy's people, and the one who does it through a human supremacist psycho lens, ends up largely getting the same amount of adoration and respect. Either one is able to fire off the Crucible and stop the Reaper threat by the same means: destruction, domination, or synthesis. Either one will be remembered as the Shepherd. Which is what brings us to Denham Pavel. After being ordered by Duke Ronway to secure a pact of non-aggression from the Dark Knights that will inevitably prove to be worth less than the toilet paper it was written on, Ronway orders Denham to head west into Galgastani territory. He is to liberate the village of Balma Musa, an ethnic ghetto where captured Wallisters are being worked to death with the intention of recruiting all able-bodied men and women to the resistance. The journey to Balma Musa is lighthearted, and strangely a little goofy along the way, thanks to Vice's immaturity. Denham is hoping to find a way to put an end to the war altogether, but his sister Kashua is more concerned with trying to escape the war with Denham and just get to safety. It's not hard to see why, of course. Even with the liberation of Castle Almorica, the Wallister resistance is surrounded on all sides by hostile powers. Survival was a miracle in itself, but victory seems to be madness. But all she has left in the world is her brother. She'll follow him, if only to try and keep him alive. Vice, by contrast, is fully in a Rico kill-em-all mindset when it comes to fighting the Galgastani. He's largely been the one who has been pushing Denham forward, wanting to get revenge for their families. He was the one who jumped Lancelot Hamilton in the first place, leading to where they are now. It's not hard to see him and Kashua in a similar lens one might see Jonathan and Walter, or Zelenin and Jimenez from the SMT series, as representatives of law and chaos. Doesn't quite work out that way in the end, though. When Denham and crew arrive, he finds that all of the Wallisters don't have the will or capability to fight anymore. All of them have either seen too many winters, or too few, and any who could fight have already either been broken by the war, or are simply trying to live out their meager lives in peace, such as they are. But they were all of them deceived, for Duke Ronway foresaw this outcome and had a different plan just in case, because the true reason for Denham to be there is to put Balma Musa to the sword and frame the Galgastani for it in a false flag operation. Leonar, Duke Ronway's right-hand man, arrives and pulls Denham aside to explain all of this, saying that if they won't be of any use alive, then dead, they'll be martyrs to rally the rest of the Wallister to fight, while causing the Galgastani to recoil, stirring dissent and fracturing their belief in their Hierophant. It's utterly bonkers, horrific, batshit insane. But given how minuscule the Wallister forces are, from a desperate, purely utilitarian way, you can almost see the logic. As things are now, there is no hope of victory. Something needs to drastically change if the resistance is going to make any real headway to breaking the Galgastani. And they are facing an enemy that wants their extinction, purely as a matter of faith. The Hierophant will not back down, and will not stop his genocide with meager words. Then comes the choice. The singular, most impactful question the game will ever ask Denham in his entire life. Will he go along with it? Will he be the dutiful soldier who simply follows orders? Or does he revolt, then turn against the Wallister resistance? Which is more important, what is right or what will win? What kind of man is Denham Pavel? I will admit, I was more than a little curious. There had been a few multiple-choice questions prior to this. The one that stood out was when Denham happened upon a member of the Bakram resistance who opposed their ruler. He'd basically usurped the throne after Dorgalwa vanished. She asked, what did Denham fight for? An end to the war, or peace for the Wallister? These might sound like they're the same thing, but what is really being asked here is, if Denham could see himself ever working with the other ethnic groups. Heavy stuff, but I didn't see any consequences to it at the time when I decided to fight for Wallister's peace. Understandably, she recoiled at the implication that Denham meant a peace only for the Wallister. I never saw her again. But something like this, surely a game from the SNES era wouldn't. It brought to mind the culling of Stratholme from Warcraft 3.
Treason! Have you lost your mind, Arthas?
But of course, there was the threat of the undead scourge that forced Arthas to make a bad choice in a terrible situation. He had a plausible excuse, at least for a while, but he would slip further and further until one day becoming lord over death itself. And while magic, monsters, and the undead do exist in Tactics Ogre, this conflict is utterly and horrifically a purely human affair. For once, I can promise you that the supernatural presence in this story is not responsible for any of the coming strife. I couldn't help but wonder, did Matsuno really have the balls to do this? Even back when, at least as far as the West was concerned, video games as a medium were primarily considered to be toys for children? I should have thought better of the man behind Vagrant Story, FF Tactics, and Shadowbringers.
I'll kill you by my own hands, Denham. I swear it!
Jesus.
There is blood on my hands. How long till it lies on my heart?
What follows afterward is a long and grueling campaign for Denham to conquer Valeria, even if the intent never crosses his lips. Weiss, to my honest shock, is horrified by Denham's decision and immediately revolts, as does Lady Ravness, who fell trying to stop the atrocity from happening. But Koshua, so desperate to not be alone in the world, stands by him, at least for a time. To the surprise of no one listening, I'm sure, Duke Ronway's madness doesn't work. At least, not completely. While most of the scattered Wallister do rally under his banner upon news of the tragedy at Balmamusa, the truth inevitably leaks out. The Galgastani, of course, don't lose the will to fight, but are emboldened even further. Their prejudice now justified by the depraved barbarism that the Wallister performed on their own people, ultimately resulting in a minor, if temporary, benefit. As within the Wallister brews a new resistance, one that wants the Butcher of Goliath's head. Something I appreciate about this moment, horrible as it is that the game isn't afraid to throw it in Denham's face over and over again. Most games, by their design, tend to keep the evil actions as isolated episodes. It happened, maybe someone will comment on it a few hours down the line, but ultimately the plot moves on. The massacre of Balmamusa lingers on Denham for the rest of his life. Its consequences are never-ending. His enemies know who and what he is, and yet despite this, not a single one flees in fear. Oh, they are afraid, terrified even, but they make it clear that they will lay down their lives to stop you out of a national pride and the defense of their homes. There's nothing like seeing an army of clergy men and women throw themselves at you in order to protect someone to really show who the monster is. And whatever possible gains Ronway could have gotten are thrown away immediately by his incompetent arrogance. After sending Denham off as a distractionary force, his main army is utterly devastated by the Galgastani, and he begins to lash out and crumble beneath the weight of his failures.
Your Grace, you must rethink this!
It is not your place to tell me what I must and must not do! Begone from my hall!
To which Leonard will eventually meet with Denham in secret, asking if he would participate in a coup d'etat for the good of the Wallister people. Setting aside the fact that no good conversation ever comes from when goons block the door, Leonard is absolutely right. Ronway is an incapable idiot. Whether it's truly for the good of the Wallister, or if Denham secretly likes the idea of taking the reins of leadership, why wouldn't he agree that Ronway must be dealt with? And so, using an opportunity given to him by the Dark Knights suddenly breaking their non-aggression pact, shocker, because Lancelot just has such a trustable face, Denham makes his power play to try and capture Ronway. But of course, one good betrayal deserves another, and Leonard, it turns out, had planned to use Denham as a scapegoat for his ascension to take command. But thanks to Vice's timely intervention, Denham wins and takes the reins of power over the Wallister people and begins his conquest over the nation. And while he himself says that it isn't his intention, his enemies see the same burning hunger for power in him that they see in themselves. Denham can deny it as much as he wants to, but when even his own sister, who it turns out is actually not blood related to him and is in fact the rightful heir to the throne of Valeria, would rather side with the Dark Knights to put an end to the war, you can't help but see where things are going, even if Denham doesn't. There is something fascinating to watch as the further the conquest goes and the more powerful Denham gets, the fewer and fewer named characters interact with him on his side. Outside of in-battle barks, depending on if they're on the map with certain foes, everyone else becomes eerily quiet. This is, of course, due to the fact that, thanks to permadeath, anyone you're able to recruit can't be critical to the plot anymore. But it does give him this image of someone who is utterly and truly alone, that despite everyone following him, no one really believes in him. Even when he travels to a number of optional towns to try and recruit more allies, the ones who join don't really do it out of any sense of loyalty or belief in him. They simply view him as the least bad option available. If your choices are a religious supremacist, the guy who seized the throne after the old king up and vanished while being obviously set up as a puppet of a foreign power, and Duke Chucklefuck Ronway, then I guess the guy who is trying to appeal to you as a common man, even if he's a war criminal, might be the only horse worth backing. You could almost think that through taking victory after victory in his own bloody fingers, that the world has simply moved past his sins in Balmamusa. Especially once you defeat the Galgastani and the Hierophant decides to take the coward's way out. When the endgame comes, and there is only Denham and the Lodician Bakram Alliance left to fight, his thoughts are filled with only one thing: saving Koshua. He knows that she is the key to the Dark Knight's plans, a waiting puppet so that they can secure Valeria for Lotus while they search for Durgalua's legacy, some strange key to the missing Dynast King's power that no one seems to fully understand. The war continues onward through siege after bloody siege, until at last Denham finally reaches his sister, who has come to terms with the bitter truth of the world, that people use and are used in turn, over and over, in an endless cycle. And so, if she were to be used, she would rather be used on her own terms. So determined is she to finally take some form of agency into her own life after being ignored, she turns her magic against Denham and battles alongside Lancelot, the very man who backstabbed Denham and the Wallister Resistance at the worst possible moment. The man who is responsible for Denham's father's fate. And after a hellish battle with Lancelot on the run for his life, Denham finally meets with Koshua again and begs and pleads for her to return to him, trying desperately to make her understand that he doesn't care if they aren't blood-related, that he truly does and has always loved and cared for her as siblings and still does. He tries to placate her fears that even him, the brother who ignored Koshua's pleas to just quit Valeria and live out their lives in peace, would simply use her as a pawn for power. Of course, she wouldn't believe him. Who would? Who even could? Who could possibly believe the words of the Butcher of Goliath? And so, Koshua takes the only road she imagines to freedom left to her, at the point of a knife. This isn't the only tragic loss that Denham will suffer. Earlier on, while Denham pursued his war against the Galgastani, he had entrusted Lancelot, the Good One, to defend Castle Almorica from the threat of the Bakram. And though he tried, in the end he was defeated by the evil Lancelot, Tartaros. There is a scene between the two of them that I find utterly fascinating. Not by the scene itself, it's a fairly typical, if well-written and performed breakdown about the two men's differing ideologies about humanity, as our Lancelot is shackled to the wall being interrogated. The good Lancelot, Hamilton, believes that the strong should protect the weak, so that they may flourish for the good of the people, that people yearn for freedom and will always revolt in the face of tyranny. Tartaros, the sinister Lancelot, disagrees, believing quite the opposite, that humanity, in their base desires and hungers, yearns for a strong, guiding fist to lead it, that the suffering and anguish inflicted by imperial rule will prevent more of it than it causes. It is the typical order versus freedom, law versus chaos debate that I think anyone would be familiar with. What fascinates me about this scene is that, in any other story, this would end with Hamilton being proven right. His allies would rescue him, and Tartaros would be slain. The good old truth, justice, American way kind of sappy idealism. Matsuno, however, takes a different path. Not long after Koshua's fate, Denham will find the broken shell of Hamilton inside of an asylum. Like Denham's father, who was left to rot after the Knights of Lotus had taken their use from him, so too was the noble knight of Zenobia. The poor man just stares out of a window, peering into an abyss that only he can see. The only thing that can stir him is the sound of his beloved wife's music box. What once brought the man joy and pleasant memories of a love lost, now only brings him suffering. Tartaros tortured him to the sound of his wife's memento, forever choking out the one good man in this world. It's harrowing to see him like this. I glossed over it, but Lancelot was something of a mentor figure who tried to help Denham find his way before Balma Musa, and even after he stuck around, albeit for his own purposes, to try and help him. That in the end, the man who helped 3 desperate youths try and make a home for themselves was reduced to this. Feels like a condemnation on humanity itself. It feels wrong to take his sword, like a perversion of the fabled mentor passing down his power to a pupil. Denham is clearly not worthy of Lombardia, and yet the Bakram and the remaining Knights of Lotus must be defeated for Valeria to know peace. In a bit of mechanical and narrative synergy that I found to be surprisingly fitting, I had made Denham into a terror knight after the massacre of Balma Musa and equipped him with a 2-handed sword. Specifically, I used an upgraded claymore, so that I could combo Breach and Terror to drastically reduce any enemy's defense he struck. Lombardia is a one-handed sword. Quite literally, my denim would never be worthy of its power. And so, it fell to the true hero of our story, Vice. Through him, Denim used its divine power to put an end to the Bakram and completed his conquest of Valeria. There was just one last task ahead of him. Because you just can't have an SRPG without some form of dark god, dragon, or demon to be the final boss, I kept wondering throughout this hellish and exhausting campaign, where are all the ogres? Now, I hope you'll forgive me for this ignorance. I had never played any of the other ogre titles before this, and had just assumed that it was just an odd naming quirk. Or maybe that the real ogres would turn out to be humanity, for our callous disregard for life and hunger for war. Turns out no. Ogres are in fact real, and they can hurt you. But these ogres are not quite the lovable dumb brutes we would normally think of them. Oh no. Ogre battle ogres are less ogre than our big dumb oaf ogres, or even Japan's Oni ogres, and are more like demons than ogres. Man, ogre is a fun word to say. You see, Lancelot and his boys weren't just exiled to Valeria, like they said. They were sent here from another outside kingdom called Zenobia. They were searching for a stolen sword called Brunhilde, a holy blade that could break the ancient seals that the ogres were locked beneath ages ago. And wouldn't you know it, a couple of the last remaining Dark Knights, including the dumbass I showed you at the beginning who shoots his own minion because he doesn't understand firearm safety, have decided it would be a real great idea to try and open the damn thing, thinking that they can obtain some nebulous power from it. And so, Denim needs to fight his way up an 18-floor dungeon, which isn't even the worst in the game, not by a long shot, that can fortunately go faster by finding secret doors to unlock shortcuts, deal with that bullshit fight, and then go down into the basement for 2 more battles and a dual boss fight. It's hard, but of course, despite killing them, it's far too late. You know, I really didn't expect that when Dorgalua disappeared, it was because he jumped into the ogre hole, but somehow it just makes sense. Dorgalua is a hell of a final boss, requiring you to deal with 2 brutal phases. First, he summons doppelgangers of your entire army. They're near exact copies, using all of the spells and abilities you equip yourself with, though fortunately not your items. And the Fallen King really likes to pull some bullshit, like turn 0 popping all of his passive skills, teleporting forward, and then instantly metering your units before they even get to move. Getting through this fight depends entirely on how smoothly you can get through Phase 1. It's really hard to get through it without someone dying, just from the sheer amount of units being close together, on top of Dorgalua's meteor spam. And the moment any of your units start to eat dirt, he'll cast Condemn, preventing you from reviving anyone ever again unless you cast the counter skill Atonement to purge it. Something that throughout this entire campaign has, to my recollection, never come up before now. I'm not going to lie. On my successful attempt, I got really lucky. Since he has Risk Management, a skill which diverts all damage he would take onto a nearby ally, you can't really focus him if he's surrounded. But fortunately, he decided he really wanted to dive for my healers in the back and exposed himself. Which leads into Phase 2, where he transforms into this, Mothman thing? And starts to teleport around the field while summoning fucking nightmares out of the pit to blast you with strong magic. It's honestly kind of fortunate that the stage transition automatically forces your armies to spread in a circle, because the range of his spells is fucking gigantic! And he acts pretty quickly too, so he's likely to blink, punch someone's lights out, and then summon a fucking terror egg to wipe out a third of your forces. My plan was simple. The same exact one I've been using the entire campaign. Bet it all on Vice. Though we did get some backup from Denim and crew, turns out that ogres are somewhat vulnerable to the good old musket. And so, wielding both holy swords Brynhildr and Lancelot's Lombardia, did Vice lay low Dorgalua and shoved him back into the hole from which he came. As the Hanging Gardens begin to collapse, Warren teleports into the chamber and banishes Denim and his soldiers, sacrificing himself for the sake of Valeria's future. Soon after, Denim is crowned king by virtue of being the only one left with any claim to the throne in Heim. But before his inauguration, he reflects back on all that he lost in his quest, worrying that he isn't worthy of ruling Valeria. But the threat of an impending invasion by Lotus and the instability of the realm demand that, at least for now, he must act the part for the people. And so, he resolves himself, moving forward with a beleaguered heart. Of course, nothing can be that easy. For even now, at the height of his power, sitting upon the throne he hath earned through blood, sweat, and strife, as he espouses about the importance of coming together and unifying now that the fighting is over at last, the people didn't forget what he did to get there. No one truly forgets.
Down with Denimorn! Glory to the Wallister!
I've trimmed over a fair amount of story in this summary. There's a good amount of intrigue and internal disagreement among the Dark Knights and the Bakram, the nature of Kashua's birth and how she came to be adopted into Denim's family, and the brief but impactful rivalry between Denim and Vice before the coup. But the reason I struggled through this game for months and came back to it over and over was because of Balmamusa. It takes a lot of courage to purposefully make your protagonist be able to do something so horrible, especially when they aren't meant to just be a player insert. More so when you decide to make your major alignment breakpoint be right at the start of your story, and not near the end, as so many games like to do. Denim is very much his own man, and oddly enough, who that man is does drastically change depending on Balmamusa and the question earlier about what he is fighting for. To think that this story, this video game, even in a more abbreviated version, existed as far back as 1995 is honestly impressive. I grew up in an era where video games as an industry and a medium struggled with trying to be more mature, more grown up, more adult. But instead of asking harder questions about ourselves as people, it took the easier way out. They tried to be the game that fucks, for lack of a better way to put it. Like every rebellious teenager, it tried to do it in that same awkward, edgy, try-hard way that we all did. Publishers like BioWare tried to give the player the option to do terrible things for the sake of choices, but in my opinion never seemed to want to explore anything in depth when it came to those actions. They just wanted to let the player feel like a cackling Saturday morning cartoon villain, which has its place, but this just felt raw and skin-crawling in the best way. Yasumi Matsuno took inspiration from real events, terrible events, that were ongoing during the time, specifically the wars in Yugoslavia and the Rwandan genocide, and poured it all into the work without restraint or trying to hand-wave it away by blaming it on some secret demon or dragon or nebulous version of corruption. Of course, there still is one, but without humanity's undying lust for power and inability to simply live and let live, he would have been sitting in his damn hole unbothered for ages more. This ending is obviously the worst outcome, since Kashua is absolutely able to be talked down by selecting the right thing in her confrontation, and she would of course go on to be the proper ruler. Denim, ashamed of his actions, would go on a journey into Zenobia to see the homeland of the man who saved him at the start of this journey. But in a way, it almost feels right that it ends like this. Not because Kashua deserves it, but because this Denim, in his zeal to achieve victory no matter the cost, I feel could only result in this ending, even if he didn't have the courage to admit it himself. I am ashamed to admit that at the story's beginning I sided with Denim when Kashua pleaded with him to flee. It was war, and the Galgastani were threatening annihilation. But the story doesn't end with just the Hierophant's death. Denim doesn't stop his war and attempt to make peace. It is my reading on the situation that he unintentionally used the excuse of trying to save Kashua, not bothering to try and actually listen to her and what she is saying, in order to try and get revenge for his father. Really, he just ends up falling onto the throne by being the last one standing. I cannot in good conscience call Tactics Ogre Reborn a bad game. It is flush with the production value that Square Enix is famous for in its remakes. Aside from the smudgy sprites, the game looks and sounds gorgeous. But I do think it is overburdened by years of trying to remake and redo the same game over and over again, resulting in a game that is being pulled apart between two eras. It tries to paint over the archaic map design and lack of mission variety by just throwing more and more mechanics and features that just result in making it a slow, laborious process. I can absolutely see why it would be worthy of such devotion. It truly is a major cornerstone in video game history, both in terms of what many SRPGs would look like in the future, but also from a writing perspective. Because while it can't avoid making its major characters into classical heroes, it still tries to show the costs and lives suffered through the throes of war. But you need to be willing to dig into the war and report for the most of it. Just as any historian would to get at the truth beneath the victor's version of it. If the chaos and neutral roots are nearly as rich and hard-hitting as the law one is, then it is no wonder why this game has been made thrice over. Just as the Shepherd is fated to succeed in stopping the Reapers no matter what version is born, Bal Mamusa too is tragically fated to burn. It's a difference in whether Denim's hands or his reputation are stained in the blood of the innocent. But I think some artifacts are better left preserved as they are, lest you risk damaging it. Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. I almost wonder if the game of Tactics Ogre Reborn is unintentionally sabotaging Matsuno's writing. That in between his tale of a man thrust into a terrible Game of Thrones by forces beyond his control, who loses everything important to him in a desperate need to try and hold on to what remains, becomes the very thing that thrust him into that situation in the first place, is just hours and hours of combat that has been overinflated in an attempt to modernize a vintage combat system to try and give it more depth than intended, to the point it takes up all of the air in the room while demanding even more. There is a lot of content left in the game. the chaos and neutral routes, of course, and a large amount of unique characters exclusive to them, an expansive 100-floor dungeon, and multiple optional bosses and what-if scenarios. Value is absolutely not lacking in this remake, so for anyone who can enjoy the combat system, there is plenty to sink your teeth into. But at the end of the day, I want nothing to do with it anymore. Which is not unusual. Most people rarely finish games, and I have always lived by the belief that if a game is no longer fun, just quit. So I can't say I didn't get something out of Reborn. But it is a rare and unfortunate thing to reach the credits and experience not catharsis, or triumph, or satisfaction, but bitter exhaustion and relief. Thank you for listening.